The service call came in on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, routine as coffee and just as bitter. Marcus Chen had been fixing arcade machines for 15 years, long enough to know the difference between a legitimate breakdown and corporate neglect, long enough to recognize the particular smell of a Chuck E. Cheese location before he even stepped through the door. It was always the same: industrial cheese, disinfectant fighting a losing battle against sticky surfaces, and that underlying electrical ozone that came from dozens of aging machines running 12 hours a day. But when he pulled up to the Millbrook location, something felt different. The parking lot was nearly empty despite it being a Tuesday afternoon, usually prime time for toddler birthday parties and stay-at-home parents desperate for somewhere to burn off their kids' energy. The building itself looked tired, like it was carrying more weight than its steel frame was designed to handle. The manager, Linda Kostecki, met him at the entrance. She was maybe 50, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Her Chuck E. Cheese polo shirt was wrinkled, her name tag slightly crooked, and when she shook his hand, her palm was damp with perspiration. "Thanks for coming so quick," she said, her voice pitched higher than necessary. "Corporate's been breathing down my neck about this machine. Kids complain it makes weird sounds. Parents are starting to ask questions, and we've got a big birthday party scheduled for this weekend." Marcus nodded, following her through the mostly empty restaurant. Two families occupied corner booths, their children playing half-heartedly with tokens, while parents scrolled through phones. The usual cacophony of electronic bleeps and bloops seemed muted, as if the machines themselves were holding their breath. "Been managing here long?" Marcus asked, making conversation as they navigated between rows of arcade games. Linda's step faltered almost imperceptibly. 5 years in October, transferred from the Richmond location when... She trailed off, then seemed to shake herself. When they needed someone with experience in older buildings. The whack-a-mole machine sat in the back corner, unplugged and gathering dust, like a monument to better times. Marcus had seen hundreds just like it, bright yellow cabinet, cartoon moles painted on the sides, hammer tethered by a coiled cord. But this one felt different. Maybe it was the way Linda wouldn't look directly at it, or how the surrounding machines seemed to give it a wide berth, their placement suggesting someone had deliberately created a buffer zone. "So what exactly is it doing?" Marcus asked, setting down his toolbox and pulling on work gloves. "Kids say it makes sounds when it's not even plugged in," Linda said, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the restaurant. "Scratching sounds, like something's moving around inside. And last week, a mother swore she heard, she thought she heard crying." Marcus paused in his examination of the machine's exterior. "Crying?" "I told her it was probably the sound bleeding over from the racing games, but..." Linda glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Look, I know how this sounds, okay? But weird things happen in old buildings. Pipes make noise, wood settles, air moves through vents in strange ways. I just need you to find whatever's causing it and fix it so corporate gets off my back." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already working. 15 years of experience had taught him that machines were honest in ways people often weren't. They broke down for logical reasons, even when those reasons had been buried under decades of Band-Aid, repairs, and willful ignorance. And they definitely didn't make sounds when they weren't receiving power, unless someone had modified them to do exactly that. The back panel of the whack-a-mole cabinet came off easier than Marcus expected. Too easy. The screws were clean, recently turned, with none of the paint and grime build-up he'd expect from 20-plus years of neglect. Someone had been inside this machine, and recently. "How often do you have other repair techs in here?" he called over his shoulder. Linda's voice came from somewhere near the front counter, farther away than before. "Not often, maybe twice a year, for the big maintenance contract. Why?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was studying the internal components, his flashlight revealing a landscape of careful modifications. Additional wiring had been run throughout the cabinet, connecting to components that had no business being in a simple whack-a-mole game. A small amplifier, professionally installed, a timer circuit that looked handmade but expertly crafted, and most puzzling of all, what appeared to be a cellular signal booster. "Linda, can you come back here for a second?" "Kind of busy with the lunch rush," she called back, though Marcus could count the customers on one hand. He continued his examination, following wire runs and documenting the modifications with his phone camera. Corporate would want detailed photos if this turned out to be unauthorized work, and his instincts were screaming that nothing about this was authorized. Then he found the phone. It was wedged behind the main circuit board, wrapped in layers of plastic and electrical tape with the kind of obsessive care that suggested profound importance. An old Motorola flip phone, the kind that had been popular in the late 90s, when digital communication was still a novelty, and parents worried about their kids having too much screen time. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Found phones weren't unusual in his line of work. Kids dropped things, forgot things, lost things in the chaos of birthday parties and sugar crashes, but they didn't usually end up sealed inside arcade cabinets, with custom wiring connecting them to the machine's power supply. Corporate policy was clear about found items. Log them, photograph them, turn them over to management for processing. But something about Linda's nervous energy, about the fresh scratch marks around screws that should have been untouched for decades, made him hesitate. He connected his portable battery pack to the phone's charging port and waited. The screen flickered to life, displaying a familiar logo, and then a home screen that looked frozen in time. The date read March 15th, 1999, 25 years ago. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he navigated to the message folder. There was only one conversation thread filled with unsent text messages, all carrying the same timestamp from a quarter century ago. March 15th, 1999, 3:47 p.m. "Help me, Mum, I'm in the wall behind the game. Please come get me, it's dark." March the 15th, 1999, 6:23 p.m. "I can hear kids playing, but nobody can hear me." March the 15th, 1999, 8:15 p.m. "The man said he was taking me to see the secret room, but this isn't a room." Marcus scrolled down, his heart pounding as more messages appeared. March 16th, 1999, 9:30 a.m. "I'm scared, Mum, why won't you come?" March the 16th, 1999, 2:17 p.m. "It's cold, and I can't move the box very much." March 16th, 1999, 7:45 p.m. "Please, Mum, please. I promise I'll be good." March the 17th, 1999, 11:22 a.m. "Mum, are you getting these? Why won't you answer?" March the 17th, 1999, 4:38 p.m. "I think I'm getting sick. Mum, please come." March 18th, 1999, 8:15 a.m. "Mum, March 18th, 1999, 8:16 a.m. Mum, please." The messages continued for 3 days, then stopped abruptly. But what made Marcus's blood run cold wasn't just the content, it was the metadata. According to the phone's internal log, these messages had been accessed regularly. Someone had been reading them, maintaining them, keeping this phone charged and operational for 25 years. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind reeling as fragments of memory began clicking into place. He'd been in high school in 1999, more concerned with college applications and weekend parties than local news, but some stories were too big to ignore. Even at 17, he remembered the search helicopters circling overhead, the amber alerts scrolling across television screens, the way conversations stopped when adults thought kids weren't listening. Tommy Hernandez, 7 years old, vanished from this very Chuck E. Cheese on March 15th, 1999, during his cousin's birthday party. Marcus could picture the missing person flyers that had appeared on every telephone pole and store window in town. A gap-toothed smile, dark hair, wearing a red Pokemon t-shirt and clutching a stuffed Pikachu. The search had been massive. FBI involvement, national media attention, volunteer search parties combing every inch of the surrounding woods and abandoned buildings. For months, Tommy's face had been as familiar as a family member to everyone in Millbrook. But it was Tommy's mother who had truly become the face of the tragedy. Elena Hernandez, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her son, had transformed overnight from a quiet house cleaner into a fierce advocate for missing children. Marcus remembered seeing her on the local news, pleading for information, offering rewards she couldn't afford, refusing to accept that her son might never come home. She'd kept the case alive through sheer force of will, becoming a fixture at town council meetings and police press conferences. Even as leads dried up and media attention moved on to newer tragedies, Elena had continued her fight. Missing Children's Foundation's legislative advocacy, support groups for families facing similar nightmares. She'd thrown herself into all of it with the desperate energy of someone who couldn't bear to stop moving. Marcus vaguely remembered reading her obituary in the local paper 5 years ago. Heart attack at 53, brought on by years of stress and a lifetime of unanswered questions. The service had been packed, the article said, with hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched through her advocacy work. But she'd died not knowing what had happened to her son. Except someone had known. Someone had been keeping Tommy's final messages alive, maintaining this digital shrine hidden behind the cheerful facade of children's entertainment. Someone with access to this building, someone who understood electronics, someone who had been carrying this secret for 25 years. Marcus examined the wall behind the machine more carefully, running his hands along the paneling and baseboards. The construction looked original, but there were tiny inconsistencies that only someone with his experience would notice. Drill holes near the floor, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Air holes designed to provide ventilation to a space that shouldn't have existed. He pressed his ear to the wall and listened. At first he heard only the building's normal sounds, the hum of HVAC systems, the distant electronic chatter of arcade games, the muffled conversation of the few remaining customers. But underneath it all, something else, rhythmic and deliberate, tap, tap, tap. Not the random settling of an old building, or the expansion and contraction of pipes. This was purposeful, almost like Morse code, as if something or someone was trying to communicate. Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Linda's voice was tight, with barely controlled anxiety. "How's it coming back there? We've got that birthday party set up in a couple hours, and I really need that corner cleared." "There's a problem," Marcus said carefully. "I'm going to need more time." "What kind of problem?" Marcus looked at the phone in his hands at the messages that had waited 25 years to be read, at the wall that might be hiding answers that a mother had died without getting, the kind that can't wait any longer. Marcus had always prided himself on being a practical man. 15 years of fixing broken machines had taught him to focus on what could be measured, tested, and repaired. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but he did believe in human nature, in the capacity for both great evil and unexpected redemption. And something about this situation felt less like a ghost story and more like a confession that had been waiting decades to be heard. He called Linda back. "I need to open up this wall." The silence stretched so long that Marcus thought the call had dropped. When Linda finally spoke, her voice was different, flatter, more guarded. "What? Why would you need to do that?" "There's been unauthorized modification to the electrical system, wires running into the wall cavity that could be a serious fire hazard. If there's a problem with the building's wiring, it could shut down the entire location." Another pause. Marcus could hear the wheels turning, the mental calculation of corporate liability versus personal risk. How long would that take? Couple hours, maybe more, depending on what I find. Marcus was already mentally cataloguing the tools he'd need. "You'll want to clear the area and probably put up some caution tape. This could get messy." Okay. But Marcus, this needs to be handled quietly. Corporate doesn't need to know about every little maintenance issue, you know. Just fix whatever needs fixing and file a standard repair report. The request sent a chill down Marcus's spine. In 15 years of contract work, he'd never had a manager ask him to downplay a potential safety hazard. "Linda, if there's something you need to tell me..." "Just fix the problem," she said, and hung up. Marcus stared at his phone for a moment, then made another call. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had given him her card 2 years ago after he'd discovered evidence of a break-in during a routine repair job. She'd told him then that arcade repair techs saw more of the city's hidden corners than most cops, and to call if he ever found anything that didn't sit right. This definitely didn't sit right. "Rodriguez here." "Detective, this is Marcus Chen, the arcade repair guy. You told me to call if I ever found something strange." "I remember you. What's going on?" Marcus looked around the empty restaurant, then at the phone in his other hand. "I'm at the Chuck E. Cheese on Millbrook Avenue. I found something you need to see." "What kind of something?" "The kind that might explain what happened to Tommy Hernandez." The line went quiet. Marcus knew Rodriguez had been a junior officer in 1999, fresh out of the academy and assigned to help canvass neighborhoods during the search. The case had stayed with her, as it had with most of the officers involved. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said. "Don't touch anything else, and don't let anyone else into that area." "What about the manager?" "Especially not the manager." By the time Detective Rodriguez arrived, Marcus had cleared the area around the whack-a-mole machine and laid out his tools. She was a compact woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of observant eyes that missed nothing. She studied the modified arcade cabinet with professional interest, photographing everything before turning her attention to the phone Marcus had discovered. "Jesus," she breathed, scrolling through Tommy's messages. 25 years. Someone's been maintaining this. According to the phone's internal logs, it's been accessed regularly. Someone's been keeping it charged, making sure the messages don't get deleted. Rodriguez looked at the wall behind the machine. "You think he's in there?" "I think someone wants us to find out." She nodded grimly and made a series of phone calls. To the coroner's office, to the crime scene unit, to her lieutenant. Within an hour, the restaurant had been cleared of customers and cordoned off with yellow tape. Linda had disappeared somewhere during the process, claiming she needed to call corporate about the situation. The cutting through the drywall was methodical and careful. Rodriguez insisted on preserving as much evidence as possible, which meant hand tools instead of power saws, cameras documenting every step of the process. Marcus had expected to find empty space, maybe some old wiring or forgotten construction materials. Instead, they found a tomb. The cavity behind the wall was larger than it should have been, a maintenance area that had been sealed off decades ago. It was just big enough for a small person to fit inside, with rough wooden planks creating a makeshift floor and ceiling. The air that escaped when they broke through was stale and wrong, carrying the unmistakable smell of decay that had been trapped for a generation. Tommy Hernandez lay curled in one corner, still wearing the red Pokemon t-shirt from his missing person poster. The small skeleton was arranged almost peacefully, as if he'd simply laid down to sleep. Beside him were the items that had sustained him during his final days. A Chuck E. Cheese cup, now cracked and empty, a small bag of tokens, and a stuffed Pikachu. Its yellow fur faded to cream, but still recognizable. But it was what else they found that made Rodriguez's hands shake as she photographed the scene. A composition notebook, its pages filled with careful observations in adult handwriting, dates, times, detailed descriptions of children who had visited the restaurant, behavioral notes about which kids were likely to wander off, which parents were distracted, which families seemed vulnerable. The notebook contained plans, floor layouts showing hidden spaces throughout the building, not just behind the arcade games, but in storage areas, utility closets, even a crawl space beneath the main dining room. It was a predator's manual, written by someone who had studied this location for years. And tucked into the back cover were photographs, Polaroids of children playing, eating, celebrating birthdays, innocent images that became sinister in context, each one marked with notes about potential and opportunity. Tommy hadn't been random. He'd been selected. The crime scene unit worked through the night, carefully documenting everything they found in Tommy's makeshift prison. The coroner's preliminary examination confirmed what everyone already knew. The boy had died of dehydration and exposure, probably within days of his disappearance. But the real investigation was just beginning. Detective Rodriguez had called in FBI assistance, given the evidence of careful planning and the possibility of additional victims. Special Agent Michael Torres arrived from Richmond the next morning, bringing with him a team of specialists and a thick file of cold cases from the late 1990s. "We've been tracking a pattern," Torres explained to Marcus, as they stood outside the sealed restaurant. Chuck E. Cheese locations, family entertainment centers, anywhere large numbers of children gather. 7 disappearances across 4 states between 1997 and 2001, all involving children between the ages of 6 and 8, all from locations that had undergone recent construction or renovation. Marcus felt sick. "You think they're all connected?" "The methodology is too similar to be coincidence. Hidden spaces, extended surveillance periods, careful victim selection. We're dealing with someone who understood construction, who had legitimate access to these buildings, and who was patient enough to plan for months before acting." The investigation into Harold Wickham began that afternoon. Wickham had been the general contractor for the Millbrook Chuck E. Cheese construction project in 1998. overseeing everything from foundation work to the final installation of arcade games. His company had also worked on several other family entertainment venues across the region during the same time period. Property records showed that Wickham had owned a small construction business specializing in commercial interior build-outs. His client list read like a map of the FBI's cold cases. The Chuck E. Cheese in Norfolk, where 6-year-old Ashley Martinez had vanished in 1997. The Discovery Zone in Virginia Beach, where 8-year-old Michael Torres, no relation to the FBI agent, had disappeared in 1998. The Fun Zone in Portsmouth, where 7-year-old Jennifer Walsh had last been seen in 2000. He created hunting grounds, Torres explained during a briefing at the police station. Legitimate construction work gave him access to install hidden spaces, to modify ventilation systems, to create the infrastructure he needed. Then he'd wait, sometimes for months, studying patterns and selecting victims. But Harold Wickham had died 10 years ago, taking his secrets with him, heart attack at 63. According to his obituary, survived by his wife Margaret and his son David. The house in suburban Norfolk had been sold to pay medical bills. His construction company dissolved, his equipment auctioned off, which meant someone else had been maintaining Tommy's phone, someone who had known about the hidden spaces, who had understood the scope of Wickham's crimes, who had been carrying that knowledge for a decade. David Wickham worked at the Chesapeake Chuck E. Cheese, 20 miles from where his father had built Tommy's tomb. He'd been employed by the company for almost 20 years, starting as part-time maintenance help and gradually working his way up to senior facilities technician. His employee record was spotless, reliable, hard-working, with commendations for going above and beyond to ensure children's safety, which made his arrest all the more surreal. FBI agents found him in the restaurant's storage room, methodically checking fire extinguishers and emergency lighting systems. He didn't resist when they announced themselves, didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't even seem surprised. He just set down his clipboard and nodded as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. "I've been waiting for someone to find Tommy," he said quietly, as they led him away in handcuffs. "I kept hoping someone would, but I was too much of a coward to. I should have done something sooner." The confession came in pieces over the next several hours, a story of complicity and guilt that had poisoned a man's life for 25 years. David had been 22 when his father killed Tommy, working summers for the family construction business to pay for community college. He'd been helping with final inspections at the Millbrook location when they'd discovered Tommy hiding in the sealed space. Dad said he'd gotten lost during the party, crawled into the wall cavity through a loose panel and couldn't find his way out, David told investigators, his voice barely audible. But I could see the phone in the kid's hand, could see he'd been trying to call for help. And Dad got this look on his face, like he was solving a problem instead of finding a scared little boy. Harold Wickham had made a decision in that moment that would haunt his son for the rest of his life. Instead of calling for help, instead of getting Tommy medical attention or reuniting him with his frantic family, he'd sealed the boy inside the wall. Not immediately. David was clear about that. Harold had left Tommy alive, trapped but breathing, with the cruel hope that he might find his own way out. He said if the kid was smart enough to get in there, he was smart enough to get out, David whispered. But he made sure that wouldn't happen, made sure the opening was sealed tight. David had been too shocked to act, too afraid of his father's temper to speak up. By the time he found the courage to return to the restaurant 3 days later, Tommy's desperate tapping had stopped. The silence behind the wall had been final. "I should have called the police right then," David said. "But Dad told me I was an accessory now, that I'd go to prison too if anyone found out. And I was scared. I was just a stupid, scared kid who let his father turn him into a monster." But David hadn't forgotten. Over the years, as his father's construction business expanded and more children disappeared, David had begun to understand the true scope of the horror. He'd started keeping records, documenting his father's projects and client lists, trying to build the courage to come forward. Every job site, every new restaurant or arcade or play center, I'd wonder if Dad was building another one of his hiding places. David explained. I started checking on his work, looking for spaces that didn't make sense, trying to make sure no other kids got trapped. After Harold's death in 2014, David had finally gained access to his father's private workshop. Hidden behind a false wall, he'd found Harold's real legacy, detailed plans for hidden spaces in dozens of buildings, photographs of potential victims, and journals documenting a decade of carefully planned child abductions. There were others, David said, his composure finally breaking. Not just Tommy, kids from all over Virginia and North Carolina, all from places Dad had worked. Some of them, I think he kept longer than Tommy. The FBI's search of Harold Wickham's former properties yielded a horror that had been buried for 2 decades. Behind the walls of the Norfolk Chuck E. Cheese, they found Ashley Martinez, still clutching the birthday crown she'd been wearing when she disappeared. In the crawl space beneath the Virginia Beach Discovery Zone, Michael Torres lay surrounded by the tokens he'd been saving to buy a prize from the redemption counter. Each location revealed the same methodical approach. Hidden spaces just large enough for a child, ventilation systems that provided just enough air to prolong suffering, and evidence that Wickham had monitored his victim's final days. In several cases, they found crude periscopes that would have allowed him to watch the children's families searching frantically just feet away from where their loved ones were dying. Jennifer Walsh, the 8-year-old who had vanished from the Portsmouth Fun Zone, was found in a space so small she couldn't have stood upright. Her skeleton was curled in the same peaceful position as Tommy's, but the personal items found with her told a different story. A small diary, written in crayon, documenting her increasingly desperate attempts to escape. Drawings of her family, her dog, her bedroom at home, and on the final page, a message that broke the hearts of everyone who read it. I forgive you for not finding me. In total, they recovered the remains of 6 children across 4 states, 6 families who had spent decades wondering, hoping, never able to truly grieve because they didn't know if their children were dead or alive, suffering or at peace. But it was the evidence of David's secret vigil that provided some measure of comfort to the investigation team. At each location, they found signs of recent maintenance, flowers left in hidden corners, small toys placed near the remains, evidence that someone had been visiting these makeshift graves for years. He was trying to take care of them, Agent Torres explained to the families during a joint meeting at the FBI's Richmond office. David Wickham spent 20 years checking on these sites, making sure his father's victims weren't completely forgotten. It doesn't excuse his silence, but it shows that someone was remembering your children, honoring them in the only way he felt he could. Elena Hernandez's sister Maria broke down when she learned about Tommy's phone messages. She'd been Elena's closest confidant during the search years, the one who had held her sister together through the worst of it. Elena never stopped believing. Tommy was trying to reach out to her somehow, Maria said through her tears. She used to dream about getting one more phone call, one more chance to tell him she was coming. And all this time, he was calling. He was still trying to come home. David Wickham's trial began 6 months later in a Norfolk courtroom packed with family members, journalists, and law enforcement officers who had worked the original cases. The charges were complex: accessory to murder, obstruction of justice, failure to report a crime. But the emotional weight was simple. For 25 years, families had lived with unanswered questions, while David carried answers he was too afraid to give. The prosecution painted him as a coward who had chosen his own comfort over the lives of 6 children. The defense argued that he'd been a victim too, terrorized by an abusive father and trapped in an impossible situation. Both sides had merit, which made the case all the more heartbreaking. Marcus found himself called as a witness, asked to describe the moment he'd discovered Tommy's phone and the evidence of David's careful maintenance. Standing at the witness stand, looking out at the packed courtroom, he tried to put into words the horror of reading those final messages, the realization that a child's desperate cries for help had been preserved in digital amber for a quarter century. The phone wasn't just hidden, Marcus testified. It was protected, wrapped in layers of plastic, connected to a power supply that would keep it charged indefinitely. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure those messages would never be lost. When David took the stand in his own defense, the courtroom fell silent. He was 47 now, graying and hollow-eyed, wearing the orange jumpsuit of the county jail. His voice was barely audible as he described the burden he'd carried since 1999. "I want you to know I thought about those children every single day," he said, looking directly at the families in the gallery. Tommy's messages, Ashley's birthday crown, Michael's tokens. I couldn't let them disappear completely. I couldn't let it be like they never existed. He described the terror of living with Harold Wickham, a man who had seemed normal to the outside world, but who had revealed himself to be a predator of the worst kind. The psychological manipulation, the threats, the gradual realization that his father was not just capable of killing children, but had built an entire system to do so, efficiently. "He told me I was already guilty," David whispered, "that if I ever told anyone what I'd seen, I'd go to prison as an accessory to murder. And I believed him. I was 22 and terrified, and I believed him." But the most devastating part of David's testimony came when he described finding his father's workshop after Harold's death. The journals detailing each child's final days, the photographs of families searching desperately for their loved ones, the technical drawings showing how to construct the perfect hidden prison. He was proud of his work, David said, his voice breaking. He kept detailed records because he thought he was accomplishing something important. And I realized that if I came forward then, I'd have to admit I'd known for 15 years and done nothing. I'd have to tell these families that their children could have been found in 1999 if I'd just been brave enough to speak up. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of quiet sobbing from the gallery. Several jurors were wiping their eyes, and even the judge seemed affected by the testimony. "So I kept checking on them," David continued. "I made sure the spaces were secure, that nothing would disturb them. I brought flowers sometimes, or small toys I thought they might have liked. I talked to them, told them their families still loved them, still missed them. It wasn't enough. Nothing could ever be enough, but it was all I knew how to do." The prosecution's closing argument was passionate and pointed. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen, no relation to Marcus, argued that David's fear and guilt, however understandable, could not excuse 25 years of silence while families suffered. 6 families lived in agony while the defendant held the key to their peace, she told the jury. 6 children's remains lay hidden while their parents searched desperately for answers. The defendant's trauma does not erase his responsibility to those families, to those children, to the truth. But the defense's closing was equally compelling. Public Defender James Walsh, who had requested the case specifically because his own nephew had disappeared from a playground in 2003, argued that David was a victim who had found the only way he could to honor the dead. David Wickham was 22 years old when he witnessed his father's crime, Walsh told the jury. He was raised by a man who turned out to be a monster, manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to use fear and guilt as weapons. And when he finally found the courage to act, he chose to remember these children, to care for them, to make sure they weren't completely forgotten. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman, a father of 2 young children, stood to deliver a verdict that satisfied no one and everyone simultaneously. Guilty on charges of obstruction of justice and failure to report a crime, not guilty on the more serious charges of accessory to murder, which the jury felt required proof of intent to aid in the original crimes. David was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with credit for time served, and the possibility of parole in 18 months. It was a compromise verdict that reflected the complexity of the case, acknowledging David's crimes while recognizing the impossible situation he'd been placed in as a young man. But more importantly, it provided closure for families who had waited decades for answers. The sentencing hearing was emotional and cathartic. One by one, family members stood, decided to address the court and David directly. Some expressed forgiveness, grateful that someone had been caring for their children's remains all these years. Others were angry, unable to move past the years of unnecessary suffering David's silence had caused. Maria Hernandez, speaking for her deceased sister Eleanor, delivered perhaps the most powerful statement. My sister died not knowing what happened to her son. She spent 15 years searching, hoping, never able to truly grieve because she didn't know if Tommy was alive or dead. You robbed her of that peace, Mr. Wickham. You robbed all of us of that peace. She paused, wiping tears from her eyes before continuing. But Tommy's final messages show that he never stopped believing his mother would come for him. And in a way she did. Elena's advocacy work, her refusal to let missing children be forgotten, led to changes in how we handle these cases. Her pain became purpose, and that purpose has helped other families find their children sooner. Maria looked directly at David, her voice softening slightly. Elena would want me to tell you that she forgives you for being afraid, but she would also want you to know that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing the right thing despite the fear. I hope you can find that courage now in whatever time you have left. After the sentencing, the FBI announced that David had agreed to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into other potential Harold Wickham crime scenes. His detailed knowledge of his father's work had already led to the discovery of 3 more hidden spaces in buildings across Virginia, though thankfully these appeared to have been unused. The cooperation agreement meant David would serve his sentence in protective custody, helping investigators understand the full scope of Harold Wickham's crimes. It was an arrangement that served justice while acknowledging the complex reality of David's situation. Elena Hernandez had been buried next to an empty grave, a headstone marking her son's absence with the words, Tommy Hernandez, forever 7, forever loved, forever searched for. Now, finally, Tommy could rest beside his mother. The funeral was held on a bright Saturday morning in May, exactly 25 years and 2 months after Tommy's disappearance. The service was small but intense, attended by hundreds of people who had never forgotten Tommy's smile or his mother's tireless search for truth. Father Miguel Santos, who had officiated Elena's funeral 5 years earlier, delivered a homily about the persistence of love beyond death, about the power of hope to transcend even the darkest circumstances. Tommy's final messages show us something profound about the human spirit, he said, his voice carrying across the packed cemetery. Even in his darkest moment, even when he was afraid and alone, he never stopped reaching out for connection. He never stopped believing that love would find him. Marcus found himself standing beside Detective Rodriguez as they lowered the small casket into the ground. The May afternoon was warm,